If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched The Accidental Tourist so that we can study plot structure. This 1988 film was directed by Lawrence Kasdan from a screenplay by Lawrence Kasdan and Frank Galati, based on the 1985 novel by Anne Tyler. Now, of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And we'd really love it if you could give our show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, I'm really interested to see what we do with this film this week. What have you got for the genres?
I think the global genre is a worldview education, and I think the secondary genre is a courtship love story with a bit of a twist in that the third person in the love triangle is Macon's ex-wife. What do you have?
Well, I had exactly the same, and I'm pleased because there were times when I thought, I think this was what it is, but I'm not sure. But I had the same as you, so that's good.
Well, before we jump into whatever it is we've both prepared for this week, I do have a question for you, if you're game to answer it. And yes, I'm totally putting you on the spot here. What was your reaction to The Accidental Tourist? Now, we're only discussing the film here this week. I really wish we had time to get into the book. And I have on my list of things to do to get back into Anne Tyler's work and compare the two. But for this week, we're just talking about the film. So when you were watching the film, what was your reaction? Did it hold your attention? Did you watch it in one sitting? Tell me how it went.
So it didn't hold my attention, and there are a few things that I was thinking about when I was watching it the first time and the second time. And the first time, I felt like I was missing pieces of the puzzle. So there were scenes in it where something had either happened before or there was a reference that you needed, but it wasn't in the film. And I felt that throughout the movie as we were watching it, that there were things that I just didn't understand. And I think the family, so Macon's family, was one of those, and understanding the dynamic and how that came to be. I think that was something that I needed more information about. There were things that I think had happened between Macon and Sarah that he refers to, but they're not in the movie, and a whole range of other things. So I really felt very like it was disjointed when I was watching it. But I also felt like, and that led me to think, I don't understand what's really going on. I can see what's going on, but I don't understand what's going on. And so the second time, I found myself really watching Macon or William Hurt's face, because I thought maybe that's where the story's being told. If I watch his face, I will have more understanding. And then there were times when that strategy worked very well, and there were times when it didn't work very well, because there were times when his face looked like he was almost going to jump out of his skin and hurt somebody, but I don't think that's really what was happening. Anyway, my attention did wander. I didn't necessarily enjoy the movie or the characters in the movie, and I really felt like I was missing information that I needed to make sense of it. What about you?
I found it very hard to stay focused on it. And for all the same reasons that you talk about. And I had to sit back and think about that after I watched it the first time. I did pause it several times and come back. And I caught myself walking away because I tend to watch on my laptop. and I caught myself walking away from the laptop and, unstacking the dishwasher and stuff like that. I thought, no, come back and focus. So after I got through the film the first time, I had to think about what was going on there. And I think the fact that Macon is a passive protagonist, which is part of a mini plot, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But because he is passive, I found it very hard to empathize with him. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. If your audience is not empathizing with your protagonist, you haven't hooked them. You've lost them. Like, it's over before it's begun. But you hit on something there that I think is really key. And I have it in my notes that I'm going to talk about more. You said you were watching William Hurt's face. And I think that's the key to this story in a film version. I think this is the type of story that lends itself very well to a novel, but is really hard to portray on a screen because the whole thing is going on in Macon's head. So you got to have a great actor to externalize the internal.
Yeah, and it's got to happen in micro. It's going to, if you have to watch someone's face, then you have to be really attuned to those micro expressions or micro gestures. And again, that's really hard to when you're watching it on a film, a 2D film, and you're not interacting with that person, to be attuned to that over such a long, 2 hours, a long period of time, relatively focused on that one character. If you're not having a two-way dialogue, it's hard.
It is, you're right. Okay, so why don't I start, after all that, why don't I start by explaining why I chose this particular movie? And it's pretty simple, really. The Accidental Tourist is one of the examples of mini-plot that Robert McKee gives in his book Story. Sean Coyne also cites The Accidental Tourist, so that made it a great starting point for me to really dive into this form of storytelling. Whenever I'm learning a new concept, this is kind of how I do it. I watch the movies and I read the books that the author or theorist offers up as examples, and then I can extrapolate out to other stories that I come across. So in Story, McKee gives a lot of film examples, which makes sense. And in the story grid, What Good Editors Know, Sean Coyne offers some more prose examples. And that makes complete sense to me for these particular reference books. Story, when it was written, it focused primarily on film. And it was only later in McKee's career that he started to expand to study his later books are all for page, stage, and screen. So the classic story form is the arc plot structure. The other story forms arise from arc plot, so we kind of need to view them relative to the arc plot story. And there are really logical reasons for this. I talked about that a lot last week, so if you haven't heard the Lego Batman episode, go back and have a listen to it, because I went into a lot of detail there. But in a nutshell, I quoted Robert McKee, who wrote that, quote, "The vast majority of human beings cannot endorse the inconsistent realities of antiplot, the internalized passivity of mini-plot, and the static circularity of non-plot as metaphors for the life they live in," end quote. And I've quoted Lisa Cron many times over the podcast, and her idea that we turn to stories to know how to act and interact with the world we live in. So arc plot makes a lot more sense to us. It resonates with us more. See that? See what I did there? So McKee teaches this whole topic of story structure as a story triangle. And that visual image really helps understand how it works. So visualize a triangle in your mind. At the top of the triangle is the arc plot. Down to the left corner, that's the mini plot, and antiplot is in the right corner. And it's kind of a sliding scale between the three. So in other words, while there are some stories that are pure arc plot and others are pure mini plot, there are also plenty of stories that are somewhere in between. McKee has The Accidental Tourist pretty far down the mini plot scale. The story was written, as we've already talked about, first as a novel by Ann Tyler in 1985, and it was adapted for film in 1988. So this is another good reason to study this, because we have a film version and a novel version. Now, according to Sean Coyne, quote, Miniplot is most often associated with the literary story culture, end quote. And both Coyne and McKee say that miniplot tends to be an internal genre. They're internal genre stories. That is, stories that are primarily about what's going on within the character. Now, I want to stop here because I can already hear people saying that their story is about what's going on inside the protagonist and that their characters have these big arcs and on and on. And you know what? Yes, you might very well be writing a mini plot story. Absolutely. But, and this is a big but, mini plot is not the only story form to feature a strong internal shift in the main character. In fact, the hero's journey, this story form that so many people want to toss out, it's an arc plot story structure, but it's really all about the character's internal journey. It's a way of externalizing the internal in a way that is palatable to a huge viewing audience or reading audience. So, it is entirely possible to have an arc plot story with a main character who has a considerable arc. So before you make a firm decision on whether you're writing a mini plot or an arc plot, think about the other aspects of mini plot. And they are, a mini plot has an open ending. And an open ending is defined as a story climax that leaves a question or two unanswered and some emotion unfulfilled. So we generally know what happens, but we're also kind of assuming and following logic that things happen in a certain way, but we don't know it for sure. In a closed ending story, we know exactly what happened. There is no guesswork. There's no room for interpretation. In a mini plot, the conflict is primarily internal. In an arc plot, it's primarily external. And when I say internal, I mean it relates to the protagonist's thoughts and feelings. Although it's entirely possible that there's conflict in the external world, for example, there might be a strong conflict in a family or within society or in the environment that the protagonist is living in, the focus of the story is on the turmoil that's happening within the character. So as Robert McKee says, and this is another quote, the accidental tourist focuses on the resurrection of this man's spirit. His transformation from a man suffering a paralysis of emotions to a man free to love and feel is the film's dominant arc of change. And I mean, I can't argue with that. Both arc plot and mini plot have a single protagonist, and it's Macon. A mini plot story has a passive protagonist, and this is a huge shift from arc plot. Now, passive doesn't mean inert, but relative to the arc plot protagonist, who is very active, the mini plot protagonist is reactive and passive. And boy, Macon sure is that. In fact, at the end of the movie, his wife, Sarah, says, well, you look at you, you finally made a decision, something like that. And he finally did. He finally did do something. Now, mind you, the doing something was his one active choice to leave Sarah for Muriel, but at least he did something. According to both McKee and Coyne, this passivity is compensated for by either giving the hero a significant inner struggle or surrounding him with dramatic events. Now, because it's a passive protagonist, the object of desire is not clear. What is it Macon wants? We don't know. Macon doesn't know. He's sort of paralyzed emotionally. I think that's the phrase that McKee used. Yes, paralysis of emotions. So he's just there, reacting to the forces that are exerting themselves on him. Sure, he has a vague general wish for happiness, or maybe his vague general wish is just to be less sad. But he may not even be aware of it, and he doesn't do anything. He doesn't do anything. And this is why I find it so hard to empathize with him. I just wanted to give him a kick in the ass and say, get up and get at it. Anyway, the inciting incident of the whole story is Sarah telling him she wants a divorce. And the inciting incident should give rise to the protagonist's object of desire. That's what happens in an arc plot story. But it doesn't do that for Macon. It just leads to a general malaise. Anyway, moving on. The timeline. In an arc plot story, it's linear. Now, McKee doesn't talk a lot about the timeline, but Sean Coyne says that the timeline can be played with, but there's still a structure. So the story still needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. So if you had a story, for example, that started with the climax and then goes back to the beginning of the story and walks you through chronologically until you get to the climax again, that's entirely possible, but there's still a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. And that kind of thing happens in TV shows, for example, all the time. You know, when the opening scene is the star of the show running away from somebody, and then they're at gunpoint, and then the next screen is 36 hours earlier, right? And then it walks you back up. That's what I'm talking about there. Now, in The Accidental Tourist, it is more or less linear, but there are some flashbacks. The next point is causality, and this has to do with one story event happening because another one happened. It's a linked chain of cause and effect events. And this is what we have in an arc plot story. Now, Sean Coyne says that, quote, adherence to philosophical causality, crucial in arc plot, is not absolutely necessary in mini-plot, unquote. He does offer two alternatives. The character is destiny and the notion that the universe is indifferent to the actions of man. Now, I'm not going to go into either one of those because, one, it's a whole other topic. And two, The Accidental Tourist is, in my opinion, primarily a cause and effect story. Macon is thrown into his internal crisis because Sarah divorces him. Sarah divorces him because she's going through a personal crisis of her own. Their marriage is on the rocks because they're both grieving the loss of their son. It's not as strict a cause and effect that you would see in an arc plot story like we saw in Lego Batman, but it's not random either. It's not arbitrary. We can follow the logic of the storyline. And the last one is consistent reality. Now, I know I am running the risk of driving you all crazy with this, but I cannot underestimate the importance of sticking to the rules you establish for your fictional world. If you break your own rules, the reader will cry foul immediately, and you're going to lose them, and you're not going to get them back. That seems to be the thing they will not tolerate, and for good reason. You can make up whatever rules you want, and the reader will go with you, but once you establish those rules, you have to stick to them. The Accidental Tourist does offer a consistent reality. As McKee says, quote, even the most naturalistic, life as lived mini-plot is an abstracted and rarefied existence. Each fictional reality uniquely establishes how things will happen within it. So the overall structure of this story, which is Miniplot, is how is it like an arc plot story? Well, there are definitely 3 acts. There is a very clear midpoint shift. We have a single protagonist. There is a consistent reality. There's more or less cause and effect happening here in the story. And it's mostly a linear timeline with a few flashbacks. So bringing it back to what I said off the top, I think honestly, Miniplot is more suited to a novel than the screen because it's primarily focused on what's going on inside the character. And that's a world that novelists can inhabit very easily. It's much more challenging for filmmakers to represent that on a screen because they can't put the camera inside the mind of the character. So that's why you have to rely on great actors or you have voiceovers, that kind of thing. They're desperately trying to externalize the internal. And it's important that I repeat this as well. Just because you're writing a story where the main character has a strong internal arc doesn't automatically mean that you're writing a mini plot story, although you may be. But consider those other things as well and consider what your goals are and which form, arc plot or mini plot, might be better suited to your story. Melanie?
Yeah, and I think also, you touched on this before, and we touched on it when we watched Lost in Translation about the medium and which medium is best to tell certain types of stories. And that's why I'm interested in reading the book, because I probably will get more from the book than I will from watching the movie, because I think, I'm forming a view that mini plot stories and those internal arcs are better suited to writing as opposed to screen or a visual storytelling format. Yeah, and that was something that really became clear for me this week as I went on my own mini plot hero's journey, trying to work out what I was going to write for this episode. All right, so the nature of the character-driven story gave me a great deal to think about when I was analysing The Accidental Tourist this week and searching for the resonance in this story. What I took away from this movie and the resonance within it was the idea that in character-driven stories, the characters need to resonate with the central dilemma faced by the protagonist and the other characters. So I asked myself a couple of questions to see how I could get into this story. And the first one was looking at what was repeated within the story. And there were quite a few things, and I'll dive into that in more detail in terms of the character. But there are some very clear visual references and things that get repeated. So visually, we see the suitcase a few times through the movie. And we also see the chair with the flying wings, and also Edward the dog, although his role is reduced and almost forgotten by the end of the film. He features, and he's very strong. He's a very strong feature for good reason at the beginning of the film. And there's also 3 homes that are featured in the film as well. From an auditory perspective, we hear Macon's voiceover reading specific sections from his book at relevant times in the movie, and that reinforces the message of the movie in case you hadn't picked it up or you're watching the visuals, and sometimes that's actually very helpful while watching this movie. So thematically, there are types of families, and the relationships within those families repeat as symbols of constraint and freedom. So the theme of marriage and how that changes a person is used frequently in the movie as well. And as I mulled the internal resonances over and over this week, I also thought about Valerie's study of this movie as a mini plot story. I came to realise that it's the characters that need to draw on the power of resonance. So I gave this a lot of thought, and I bounced around the idea of stereotypes and nearly fell down the trope TV rabbit hole a few times, because I don't think the characters are stereotypes all based on tropes. I thought about Macon's character as an archetype, and an archetype is a role that the character plays. So other than the protagonist or the hero, I don't think Macon's character plays any other role in this story. However, this prompted an interesting line of thought, and I'm going to read to you an excerpt from the conversation Valerie and I had this week. And this was at the point of the week when I was contemplating whether Macon was a stoic guy kind of character, because Macon says to Sarah when she tells him that he's emotionally muffled, that he was staying steady. And he says in a voiceover later in the movie that it is an unfortunate fact that even the most conscientious traveller cannot be prepared for every encounter. At such times, one must remain calm and rely on their innate common sense. So, when I was writing to Valerie, she asked me if I meant stereotypes instead of archetypes, and I answered this. I think archetypes are a subset of resonance. We don't need a stoic guy or a tough guy in all stories, not like a gatekeeper, but there are certain things we expect from them when they appear. The type of hero we choose, and in this case, maybe a stoic person, will depend on the story, but also tell us the type of arc they have to have. What do you think of the following? Arc plots need external action, whereas mini plots have micro actions at the facial expression level. The type of stoic person can be static, as in James Bond, negative, as in Francesca from The Bridges of Madison County, or positive, like Mason. So we haven't discussed archetypes on the podcast yet, but I'd like to know what archetype you think Macon is, Valerie. And, do you want to add to that conversation or line of thought a little bit here?
Well, I think there are different types of archetypes. Like everything else in this business, we have to think about the concept that's being discussed, not the label, because we do have archetypes within the hero's journey, for example, like you said, the gatekeeper or the mentor or the sidekick. Those are roles that a character can fulfill in the storytelling. But then there's other types of archetypes. If you think about the father archetype or the mother archetype, like in Black Swan, when we meet Nina Sayer's mother, when we hear mother, there's something that we think about. We think about someone who is nurturing, who is loving, who has unconditional love, and who always has the child's best interest at heart. In Black Swan, the filmmakers have completely subverted that. So they've taken our assumption, that archetype of mother, and turned it on its ear. So if we give our character, whether it's the protagonist or not, this type of identifier, whether it's the role within a family, it could be a job, it could be whatever, it's like shorthand for the reader. We don't have to explain that a mother is nurturing and caring and blah, blah, blah. They will just think that it is that. So I think we need to kind of separate those two types of archetypes out. In terms of heroes, or protagonists, there are 4 different types. There's the hero, and when I say 4 different types of protagonists, it's relative to the reader. So the hero is somehow superior to the reader. Think of all the Marvel superheroes. Like, we can't fly. We don't have any of those superhero abilities, but they do. They're bigger, better, faster, stronger than us, and we aspire to be them. It could also be someone who's not a superhero, but human, who is somehow better, stronger, faster than us, and we still aspire to be that type of person. Then we have the underdog, who is a protagonist that is somehow lower than the reader. They are disadvantaged somehow, and the task before them is really big. We always root for the underdog. We can't help it. We really, really want the underdog to succeed. It's almost like there's built-in empathy, because we are all the underdogs in some area of our lives. The next type of protagonist is the everyman or every woman, and that type of protagonist is on par with the reader. So they're just like us. Like, we totally get it. Totally get it. And the 4th type is the anti-hero. So they're not great people necessarily, but in their world of baddies, they have at least some redeeming quality. So what type of character is Macon? I would say he is, well, you could lean on the father archetype. You could lean on a husband archetype. You could lean on the writer archetype, which I do not fit in any way, shape, or form. I'm not wired that way. But there is a writer archetype, someone who is very shy or introverted, who doesn't leave home a lot. And Macon fits into a lot of that. He's very unassuming. He is someone who prefers to observe the world around him rather than being involved in the world around him.
Yeah, that would suit him, wouldn't it? That writer, maybe that more writer archetype than any of those ones that we've sort of really you've nailed down there in the 4 types of protagonist.
And I think we've got to be careful that we don't let the archetype, which is, I think, a starting point, a shorthand, that we don't let that slide into stereotype.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, yes, because, and I don't think that Macon is a stereotype. So I think that's actually quite a redeeming factor about him as a character. He's quite unique in the way of characters as a main character in a movie, and yeah, and I think you're right. We have to be very careful. In our first drafts, fill your boots. Write whatever it takes. But then, as you go through, and you're editing and you're rewriting, that's where you can start to be more nuanced as opposed to stereotypical in developing characters' actions and thoughts. Yeah.
Here,
No,
here.
that's really interesting. So maybe, I don't know if I want to go down the whole archetypes. There's a lot of archetypes, and I don't know if I want to go down that on the podcast, but maybe one season we'll touch on something.
We'll add it to the list.
I don't know.
Our growing list
Yes.
of topics, we'll just add it on there.
Yes, and we'll see when we get there. Right. Now, I mentioned that I think Macon believes that he's a stoic man. And so I did follow this line of thinking for a while to see, well, what is a stoic man and why is that different from the tough guy? So the tough guy and the stoic man do cross over, but the main difference between them is anger. Whereas the tough guy tends to be an angry person or it displays emotion externally when he's angry. So, and anger is the only legitimate emotion, I think, permissible for the tough guy, whereas the stoic man doesn't even let anger get the better of him. And a good example of a stoic man would be Dr. Spock and the Vulcans from Star Trek. They are a race of logical and reasoned people. They are not unemotional, but they control their emotions so that logic is not overruled by emotion. Spock is half human, so the implication is that he will struggle more than most Vulcans to keep his emotions under control. Now, other examples of the stoic man would be Aragon, Sherlock Holmes, and Batman. And Batman even wears a mask as a symbol of his stoicism. But, I don't mean Lego Batman, I mean the more comic book Batman. However, the more I thought about this, the more Macon being a stoic man didn't work. So Macon is not logical. He's emotionally stunted. He's broken, and we see him break on the screen when he identifies Ethan's body. So Macon thinks he's being stoic, but he's actually withdrawing from the chaos in his life. So where did this leave me with resonance in this Miniplot story? Well, that's a very good question. So it left me with the central character Macon and the other characters and how they reflect aspects of Macon's character. Now, last week I went through Dave Farland's 3 types of resonance. So the first being genre, the second life, and the third emotional needs. So the accidental tourist's examination of family, marriage, and grief fit into the life type of resonance for me. And life resonance centers around people searching out stories that resemble their own life experience. So our societies and communities are built around shared moments, and it's these shared moments that connect us as individuals. We may not have experienced something ourselves, but our empathy for our friends, family, and acquaintances provides us with an understanding of their lives and experiences. And so here is how I think the accidental tourist uses resonance. So Sarah and Macon have lost a child. Their different grieving styles have opened a chasm in their relationship that they can't bridge. And Sarah asks for a divorce. So Macon, already broken from Ethan's death, shuts down further. So this is a broken family. And while we can't always say we understand Macon's loss, we can understand how large these seismic shifts of these life events are. Now, the Leary family, which is made up of Macon's sister Rose, and his brothers Charles and Porter, who all still live together in the family home where Rose organises everyone. Families are their own beasts, and the Learys have their own understanding of each other. And we see this via the card game that they play, as well as through their decision to stop answering the phone because Macon thinks it's nice to be unconnected for a while. Now, it's at home with the Leary siblings that the two main aspects of life resonance, I think, intersect in the story. And by that I mean family and marriage. Now, and I'm only going on the movie, right? So just remember that. So Macon was the only one of the 4 children who was married. The other 3 have remained in some sort of codependent stasis as adults. However, Macon's marriage breakdown and subsequent broken leg were the catalyst for Rose to meet Macon's publisher, Julian. Now, Rose and Julian become romantically involved and even marry. However, Rose returns to home with Charles and Porter because they don't seem to be coping if she's not there. Now, we all know some odd and quirky families with ties that can't be explained or broken. And Julian eventually, because he can't compete with the Leary family, moves in with Rose, Charles, and Porter to enable his marriage to continue. Now, Julian and Rose have been subsumed by the Leary children bond, and when Julian moves back in, they become 4 again in the household. And I thought that was just an interesting thing to note because Macon obviously moves out again when he lives either with Muriel or Sarah. So Macon appears to be the only one who's broken away from the sibling codependency. And then we have Muriel and her son Alexander, and they also offer a different take on marriage and family. And when Macon is with these 2 in their slightly rundown home, we actually see him at his happiest. He is animated and his grief no longer seems to consume him. And it is a different type of family and one that Macon has had to graft himself into. So Muriel would like to be married, but Macon is not so keen. And he is still holding back. He hasn't shaken off the remnants of his muffled emotional state when he deals with Muriel, I think. This is Macon's emotional baggage. And he has 2 types of baggage. He has the physical one, which is packaged meticulously, and he has the emotional one, which he can't unpack or shake. Well, the physical bag is a metaphor for Macon's view of the world. We all know that how we pack a bag or unpack a bag or organise our luggage gives us a certain insight into the type of person that we're dealing with. Now, what we see in this movie and in life via Macon, apart from his emotional stuntedness, is how he behaves differently depending on who he's with. With Sarah, there's a familiarity that comes with being married for 20 years. When he's with his siblings, Macon is acutely aware of all their quirks and their differences. And he is almost half in, half out within that family unit. And the Learys represent a different type of relationship, one that's forged over time with a blood connection. And siblings occupy a unique role in people's lives because they have travelled a similar road in a person's formative years. And as just a quick aside, there's a resonant part about the Leary siblings for me, and it's that it mirrors my own children. So I have 3 boys and a girl. Although I have little fear that they will all live together after I'm gone, they do have their own quirks and ways of relating to each other that are interesting and unique. Right. Okay, so back to the type of person that Macon is and who he is depending on who he's with. So he grows into someone else when he's around Muriel, and I think this is completely understandable. And Macon summarise it neatly when he tells Sarah he's leaving to be with Muriel, and he says, quote, "I'm beginning to think that maybe it's not just how much you love someone. Maybe what matters is who you are when you're with them," unquote. So Muriel has given him another chance to decide who he is. And now that I think about it, a mini plot story should use resonance based upon life experiences, but it took me a while to work this out. Or perhaps I was a bit like Macon myself this week. So, Valerie, what are the action steps that you have for us?
Just before I get into that, I think for me, my reaction to this film is that it's a story that lends itself better to a novel. So I really want to go back. I don't want anyone to be left with the impression that Miniplot is somehow not as good a story structure. I think that in the case of The Accidental Tourist, it's just a really tough one to translate to a screen. Because there's lots of mini plot stories that I love. Okay. Today's action step. I want you to think about the film that I asked you to choose way back at the beginning of the season. That's the one that is like the story that you are writing. How does it stack up so far? Is it more like the arc plot story with an active protagonist? Or more like a mini plot story with a passive protagonist? Think about the novels and the films that you enjoy most. Is the protagonist active or passive? That'll help you understand what you're naturally drawn toward and what you may be writing and what you may want to write.
All right, so that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we dive into The Shape of Water. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find out about books to help you read like a writer, visit me on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.